I'm Ethel. The winter had just begun to loosen its hold on Pennsylvania when the thick, official-looking envelope arrived. It was the kind that carried life-changing decisions. I held it in my hands for what felt like an eternity before I finally dared to open it. As the words blurred through my tears, I read, "Petition for guardianship is hereby granted." It was done. After months of hearings, home visits, interviews, and endless paperwork, little Leo was officially part of our family. The day we brought Leo home was overcast and cool, with the sky heavy with the promise of spring rain. He clutched a small backpack, all his belongings, and stared wide-eyed at our brick house on the outskirts of Harrisburg. "This is where you live?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "This," I said, smiling through my tears, "is where we live now." My husband, Henry, had transformed the smallest bedroom into a haven for Leo. The walls were painted a soft green, shelves were filled with books and toy airplanes, and there was a sturdy wooden desk by the window. On the bed was a quilt I'd sewn myself, stitched with little clouds and birds that reminded me of the stories my daughter, Rose, used to love. Leo ran around the room, touching everything, his excitement bubbling over. "Is all of this mine?" he asked. "It's yours," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of it. And the room down the hall, that's where Grandma hides the cookie jar." Leo giggled, and the sound filled the house, a sound we hadn't heard in far too long. But it all started on an autumn night. I was 55 then, and my evenings were predictable. A cup of mint tea, a few pages of a mystery novel, and the hum of the refrigerator were my only company. I liked it that way. Surprises usually led to heartbreak. But that night, as I reached the top of the stairs, the phone rang. It was late, much too late. Calls after dark always carried a certain weight, like a silent alarm that made my heart skip a beat. I froze for a second before walking back down the hallway, each ring echoing louder in the quiet house. "Hello," I answered, my voice cautious. What came next was not at all what I expected. It was a child, a boy's voice, small but determined. "Hello, are you Ethel?" he asked. My hand tightened around the receiver. "Yes, I am." "Who's speaking?" "I'm Leo," he said clearly, as if he'd rehearsed it. "I'm your grandson. Please come get me from the children's home." For a moment, time stood still. The hallway, the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator all faded away beneath the weight of his words. "Grandson?" My heart thudded painfully in my chest. "I think you must be mistaken," I managed, my voice trembling. "I don't have a grandson." "This isn't a mistake," he insisted. "I found out about you and I wanted to call. They don't let us use the phone, but I did it anyway. Please come get me. I don't want to stay here." And then the line went dead. I stood there, frozen, the dial tone buzzing faintly in my ear. I didn't even remember hanging up. The words kept replaying in my mind, "Grandson, please come get me." Henry appeared at the end of the hall, startled by the ringing phone and the look on my face. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice still thick from sleep. "Our grandson," I whispered, barely believing the words myself. "He said he's our grandson." Henry blinked. "What are you talking about?" "Ethel, we don't have a grandson." He knew my full name, I interrupted, my voice rising. And his voice, Henry. It sounded like Rose's when she was little. Rose, our only daughter, our pride and joy. She had been the center of our world. She was smart, kind, and full of dreams. But one warm summer evening, everything changed. She had just graduated from high school, and college acceptance letters were pinned to the corkboard in her room. We were so excited about her bright future. But that night, she called us into the living room. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something. I've fallen in love and I'm getting married." The silence that followed was deafening. Henry blinked, thinking she was joking. Married? Rose? That's ridiculous. You're 18. You have college ahead of you. This is real, she said, her chin lifting defiantly. I love him and he loves me. We want to be together. I felt my stomach twist. You're far too young for this. You barely know what you want in life. What about your education? Your plans? I don't want to wait, Rose said, her voice breaking slightly. We've been together for 2 months. He's not from around here. He was just here on business when we met. He's gone home now, but he wants me to come with him. 2 months? Henry repeated, his disbelief turning to anger. And he hasn't even had the decency to meet us, to ask for our blessing. That's not how people do things anymore, Rose shot back, her voice rising. This isn't the 1950s. We love each other. That's all that matters. No, I said, the words slicing through the air. It's not all that matters. He's a stranger and you're not going anywhere. Rose's eyes filled with tears. You're not even listening to me. You don't understand me at all. We understand more than you think, Henry said. And we're saying no. You are not leaving. I'm not asking for your permission, she cried before storming down the hallway and slamming her bedroom door. That night, the house felt cold. Henry and I sat in silence, telling ourselves that by morning she'd calm down. We'd talk like adults and find a way through this. But when I knocked on Rose's door at dawn, ready to apologize and talk things through, the room was empty. The bed was unmade, clothes were scattered across the floor, and Rose was gone. We called all her friends, but none of them had seen her. We drove through town, retraced her usual routes, and checked the bus station. Nothing. Finally, we filed a missing person report, but the police shrugged. Rose was 18, legally an adult. If she left on her own, there was nothing they could do. Weeks turned into months. I stopped sleeping, staring at the phone as if willing it to ring. Henry tried to stay strong, but the pain showed in his eyes. The quiet dinners with an empty chair were a constant reminder of our loss. And then, 2 years later, the phone did ring. It was a detective from Maryland, his tone formal and apologetic. Rose's name had appeared on the manifest of a commercial flight that had gone down in bad weather. There were no survivors. Personal effects had been recovered, a locket her grandmother had given her and a charm bracelet Henry and I had gifted her on her 16th birthday. The detective explained that one of the victims was carrying identification and personal belongings registered to Rose. Though the remains were badly damaged, preliminary DNA testing from a hairbrush found among the wreckage had shown a partial familial match with samples provided by us, enough for the authorities to conclude it was her. What we didn't know at the time was that Rose had lost her wallet during a visit to a crowded fair 2 weeks earlier. She had canceled the cards inside and moved on, but someone had picked it up. And when that person later boarded the ill-fated flight using Rose's ID, everything changed. The funeral was a blur. I remembered the smell of lilies, the rain on the windshield, and the feel of Henry's hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. I felt like I had failed as a mother. From that year on, birthdays were no longer celebrated in our home. The day Rose was born, once the happiest day of our lives, had become just another day to get through. But while we were searching desperately, Rose was living a different life. She boarded a bus headed east and never looked back. Days later, she stepped off in a small coastal town in Virginia, where seagulls cried over the pier and the salty air carried the smell of fried fish and sea breeze. There, she reunited with Jack, the man she had chosen over everything else. Jack was a few years older, confident in a way that made Rose feel safe and alive. He spoke about the future with certainty, as if life would unfold just as they dreamed if they only held on to each other. "We don't need anyone else," he would say, brushing her hair from her face as they watched the sunset over the ocean. "It's you and me, Rose. That's all that matters." They rented a small 1-bedroom apartment above a surf shop. It had creaky wooden floors and a view of the water if you leaned out the window far enough. To Rose, it was freedom. They spent their days walking on the beach, stealing kisses on the pier, and talking late into the night about the family they would build. Weeks turned into months. Their love deepened, and their small routines became a rhythm Rose cherished. Cheap takeout dinners on the floor, shared cups of coffee as the sun rose, and Jack's arms around her when the ocean wind turned cold. But one morning, Rose woke with a heaviness she couldn't ignore. The smell of coffee made her stomach churn, and the world tilted slightly when she stood up too fast. Days passed, and the nausea stayed. And then, in the bathroom of their apartment, she stared down at two pink lines that changed everything. Pregnant, she whispered to herself, her hands trembling as she waited for Jack to come home. When he finally stepped through the door, she blurted it out before fear could stop her. "Jack, I'm pregnant." For a heartbeat, his face was unreadable. Then he smiled, a wide, boyish grin that melted her anxiety. He pulled her into his arms, laughing. "We're having a baby," he said almost in disbelief. "Rose, this is the best news you could have given me." The days that followed were filled with whispered plans and late-night promises. They talked about baby names, about saving for a bigger place, and about the life they would build as a family. Jack swore he would take care of them. "I'll work harder than I ever have," he told her, pressing his forehead against hers. "You won't have to worry about a thing." But beneath his excitement, Rose sensed an undercurrent of restlessness. He spent more time out late, coming home with vague stories about people he was meeting and opportunities that were too good to pass up. One night, as they sat on the couch with the sound of waves crashing outside their window, Jack mentioned it. "There's this job," he said casually, as if testing her reaction. "It pays more than I could make in a year, maybe two. It's a one-time thing, Rose. Just one night, and everything changes for us." She frowned. "What kind of job?" He kissed her hand, avoiding the question. "The kind that sets us up for life. Trust me." Rose wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that their love and their future would be enough to shield them from whatever risks lay ahead. So she nodded, pushing aside the uneasy feeling in her stomach. She couldn't know then that the choice Jack was about to make would shatter their fragile dream. The night Jack spoke of that one-time job came and went, and with it, the fragile peace that had wrapped around Rose's life by the sea. He left after dinner, kissing her forehead and promising he'd be back before sunrise. She stayed awake long after midnight, unable to shake the unease that had taken root in her chest. Each passing hour, without word from him, deepened the knot in her stomach. And then, just before dawn, a sharp knock on the door shattered the silence. It wasn't Jack. It was two police officers. "Are you Rose?" One of them asked as she stood frozen in the doorway, still in her nightgown. "Yes," she whispered. The older officer shifted uncomfortably. "Jack was arrested last night during a jewelry store robbery. We need to ask you a few questions." The words barely made sense. Arrested, robbery. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. They questioned her briefly about how long she'd known him, where he'd been that night, and whether she knew anything about the crime. She had no answers. She barely heard them. When they left, the tiny apartment that had felt like a dream now felt unbearably small and suffocating. Days later, she attended his arraignment, standing quietly in the back of the courtroom while the charges were read: breaking and entering, grand larceny, possession of stolen property. Jack wouldn't meet her eyes. When the judge set bail far beyond anything she could afford, Rose's knees buckled. It was real. All of it. The man she had trusted with her future, with her child's future, had thrown it all away for a job. At the sentencing hearing weeks later, she sat on a hard wooden bench, her heart pounding as the judge delivered the words that would change everything. 8 years in state prison. Rose clutched her belly, the small swell that held their unborn child, and felt her world tilt. When she stepped out of the courthouse into the sharp coastal wind, she was no longer the girl who had run away for love. She was alone, pregnant, and with no one to turn to. In the days that followed, Rose barely left the apartment. Bills piled up on the table. The whispers of neighbors who had seen the news seemed to follow her down the street. She imagined their judgment, the pity in their eyes, the foolish girl who ran away for a man and ended up with nothing. Nights were the worst. That was when the voices in her head were the loudest and cruelest. That's who you chose. You threw away your future, your family, and now you want us to help. You made your bed, lie in it. She could hear our voices even though we'd never said those words. Maybe we would have welcomed her home. Maybe we would have forgiven everything. But shame built walls higher than any distance, and Rose didn't know how to climb over them. So she stayed silent. The months crawled by. She sold what little she owned and moved into a smaller apartment closer to the docks, where the rent was cheaper and the neighbors didn't ask questions. She kept to herself, working odd jobs when her body allowed, and prepared for the baby's arrival as best she could. She talked to the child growing inside her as if he could understand. "We'll be okay," she whispered into the dark. "I'll make sure of it." 9 months after Jack's sentencing, on a gray and windy April morning, Rose gave birth to a baby boy. The nurses placed him in her arms, warm and impossibly small, his tiny fists waving in the air as if reaching for her heartbeat. She named him Leo, a name she had chosen quietly during the long, lonely months of her pregnancy, a name that meant brave little lion. The early weeks were hard but sweet. Rose had little money and no family nearby, but Leo's presence filled her small apartment with a light she hadn't felt in years. She whispered stories to him about the ocean they could see from their window, about the life she hoped to give him, a life far brighter than the one she was living now. When Leo was 6 weeks old, Rose received a letter from Jack. He wanted her to visit him at the state correctional facility 2 towns over. He'd been writing for weeks, he said, but she hadn't answered. He missed her. He missed their son. "Please come," he wrote. The visit meant everything to her. Maybe they could talk about the future, about co-parenting, about how to make this work. But it was also complicated. Infants weren't allowed inside the facility, and she had no family or friends to leave Leo with. That's when she met Mrs. Helen Thompson, a retired schoolteacher who lived down the hall. Helen was kind and soft-spoken, with white hair and a love for knitting. She had seen Rose struggling with a stroller one afternoon and offered to hold the door. Soon, the 2 women were talking over tea. Helen told Rose she'd raised 2 children of her own and would be happy to watch little Leo for a few hours whenever she needed a break. The offer felt like a blessing. On the morning of the visit, Rose bundled Leo into a soft yellow blanket and kissed his forehead. "I'll be back soon," she whispered. "Be good for Mrs. Thompson." The bus ride to the prison was long and silent. Rose rehearsed what she might say to Jack, how angry she was, how betrayed she felt, and yet how desperately she wanted their son to have a father. The visit itself was a blur. Jack looked thinner, harder around the edges. He talked about appeals and early release, about dreams of a house and a job waiting for him on the outside. Rose listened, but said little. Something in her had changed. By the time she stepped off the bus that evening and started the walk back to the apartment, the sky had turned orange. But as she rounded the corner onto her street, she saw flashing red and blue lights. 2 police cruisers, an ambulance, and a small crowd gathered near the entrance of her building. Rose's heart lurched. She pushed through the onlookers and stumbled inside. A paramedic was rolling a stretcher out of Helen's apartment, and on it lay Helen herself, pale and still beneath a sheet. "Ma'am, are you Rose?" An officer asked gently. "We need to speak with you." The words blurred together. "Heart attack, no signs of foul play, pronounced dead at the scene." But all Rose could think was of Leo. "Where's my son?" she cried. "He's safe," the officer assured her. Neighbors heard him crying and called 911. He was alone when first responders arrived. He's been taken into protective custody until a guardian can be located. But there was no guardian. There were no documents tying Rose to Leo. No birth certificate listing her name, no emergency contacts, no family nearby. By the time she reached the Virginia County Department of Human Services, Leo had already been placed into a county contracted group home. There, staff gave him a placeholder surname and a case number. And Rose, she never showed up again. Maybe it was panic. Maybe it was despair.